Hello and welcome to the next episode. This time we will talk about the different levels of abstraction that you have built in Spring Data Neo4j. I just want to excuse me that it's taken more than 1 year and Neo4j already changed its logo. So I also needed to redraft those logos and I found several things to do to not record the video. But now's the time. I hope you enjoy it. I said that we will talk today about the different levels of abstraction that you have within SDN. You can see that all of these abstractions sit on top of the Java driver. We have the Neo4j client, the Neo4j template, and the repositories. This is also the natural flow when we communicate with the database. For instance, a Neo4j repository can only communicate via the Neo4j template that can only communicate via the Neo4j client with the driver and thus with the database. Just a second. Another important thing why you want to choose one of the components in our abstractions hierarchy and not directly the Neo4j driver, for example, when it comes to war operations, etc., is that all of those three components participate in a Spring transaction. That means if this transaction fails, everything will get rolled back. Other than this, if you would, for example, execute a transaction function as a driver, it would be a transaction on its own and it's not connected to the other operations that will go on within your method. Thanks a lot and have fun with this guy. In this episode, I will show you when and how to use those different levels of abstraction. In the last episode, I already created a repository. We used the movie domain and we mapped some movies and actors. This was pretty straightforward, but if you want to have more freedom and not to work so domain-driven design-centric, it's a good advice to have a look at the Neo4j template and the Neo4j client. Also, it might be possible that you, for example, create some kind of aggregation function or aggregation object by using the Neo4j client. We will come to this in a bit. First, let's talk about what's in there. As I said, the Neo4j client is the technology that talks with the Neo4j driver to the database. So the Neo4j client, when we look at this, looks more or less like a Neo4j driver, just with a Fluent API. But that's not all. There are two kinds of methods in there that give you all the possibilities we will need at the highest abstraction level to get the mapping functions or binding functions. With binding function, I mean how to bind parameters to your queries, and with mapping, how to generate objects out of the results. And with this API, we already got everything at hand that we need to create on top this full-fledged object graph mapper called Spring Data Neo4j. How does it look in detail? Like we did last time, we will take the movie example, populate the database with it, and then create a Spring Boot application using Spring Data Neo4j. After we've created this application, we can inject the Neo4j driver and create a simple call to the database. After we've created this call, we can make use of the mapping function. The mapping function now allows us to describe how the return data should get transformed into this movie object. Before we start the application, we need to make sure that we have the right application properties set. Those are most of the time, if you follow the examples, just UI, the Neo4j user, and your password for the database. After you've done this, you can start the application and see the results. As you can see, we needed to explain how to map the data. That's typically what you don't assume when you're using an object graph mapper. But this level of abstraction does not know anything about the context it's running in. So it has no metadata about the domain. One level upwards, we have the Neo4j template. The Neo4j template is aware of all the mapping you have done to your domain. It knows about the nodes you have defined, the relationship between nodes, and other metadata. So when you're using a Neo4j template, for example, with the very same query we have written before in the Neo4j client, you can get the objects created instantaneously. So you do not need to define anything. Because of the derived metadata, we know how to map the object. Let us now also inject the Neo4j template to have another method to compare. Now, as I told you, there's no mapping code that's needed to get written. Everything happens by generating the right mapping functions for you in SDN. And the result is the very same movie. Now's the time where you might ask, why should I use the Neo4j client at all? There are times when you might need some kind of an aggregation function or similar to get returned. Or you just want to return a specific field. You do not want to get limited by the, let's say, boundaries you create yourself by having this schema within the metadata. It's also possible, and I link this in the video description, to map objects within the Neo4j client. For example, for aggregation functions, where you want to have a scalar result like a movie compared with an aggregation of how many people have watched this movie. You do not want to have this within the movie mapped, but alongside the movie. The follow-up question, of course, is when to use then the Neo4j template, because we have the Neo4j repositories on top that can map domain objects, also with custom queries. And we have the Neo4j client that can execute war, cipher statements, and process the results manually. So the Neo4j template is needed when you try to use Neo4j repositories, for example, but you have a corner case where you do not want to create a repository for your domain object. Typically, a repository is created for an aggregate root when you are really working domain-driven design centric. That means, on the other hand, yet you do not have a repository for every entity at hand. And you shouldn't. Of course you shouldn't. But there might be a case where you just need, so you have this one use case where you want to execute something for a different domain object than you have repositories for. This is one case. Also, of course, it's not forbidden to have no repositories at all, but only use a Neo4j template, pass over the type, and, for example, the custom cipher method. You can benefit in the Neo4j template, of course, of all the metadata that you have provided and that SDN understands. And with this derived metadata, you do not need to take care about mapping. And as I said, if you need even more freedom, use the Neo4j client. That's pretty much it for this episode. It was shorter than expected, but I hope you learned something important. If you have any questions, reach out to us over GitHub or the Discourse. All links are in the description below. And if you really want to see another episode, please subscribe and like the video. Thanks a lot, have a nice day, and goodbye.